This is the feedback video for assignment number 6. Let's take a look at the assignment. In this assignment, we were looking at landscape photographs and also action photographs. So what I've asked you to do is to submit 2 landscapes that demonstrate the rule of thirds. And I think this is still an issue with some students that they don't really grasp this. So let me just take a second here to go over the rule of thirds again. The idea is in this horizontal format, of course if you were doing a vertical you just rotate that 90 degrees, but you would divide your image area into thirds. 1, 2, 3, and then thirds again, 1, 2, 3. And that each one of these intersections, there being a total of 4, are sort of the sweet spots where you want to have your primary subject. So let's look at a couple of examples here. So on this close-up here of a bee, you can see the lines here, and the eye of the bee is right on that intersection right here. Now you can use these other 4 points as well because there are 4 sweet spots. Actually, our eyes are kind of accustomed to these upper ones here. But let's look at another example here. In this photograph, which is a candid photograph, it's not really a portrait because the subject here doesn't exactly know that we're looking at him through the camera. And you can see this isn't precisely on this vertical line, but the eyes are definitely on this line. So in a horizon sense, you want to have the horizon line either on this one or on this one. And then when you have a subject in it, it's going to be better if you get it close to one of these sweet spots. So here's another example here with an individual, and this is more of a portrait for sure. And as you can see, she is aligned on this vertical, and this is really kind of more important than if her head was right in this point here on this particular image, because she's somewhat further away than just a headshot. So that was the rule of thirds. And then we wanted something with a dominant subject in the foreground and the landscape behind. And then 2 others that were any kind of landscape photos that you wanted to submit. On this second part, we called it either candid or documentary or action. And it's an entirely different type of photograph from the landscape. I think a lot of you tried to apply the landscape and this in the same situation, but it wasn't necessary. So you were going to stop the action to freeze it. And then this is a different idea. Capturing the moment isn't necessarily using a high shutter speed where you're seeing drops of water frozen in the air. It's more like being there at the right time to get a really cool photo. And then you were going to submit 2 others of your own. So let's go on in and look at some of the better work that was submitted. I always try to give you this feedback in a positive sense, and I use examples that are essentially good examples from the work that was turned in by the students. I don't want to just put up stuff that didn't quite get the appropriate application of what was asked for. I want to show positive things. So let's look at this rule of thirds. Now this is a landscape that Allison turned in here, and you can see this tree is pretty much on what would be the third lines, and then this horizon line back here is pretty close to where the horizontal third line would be. So that's a pretty appropriate application. Now this, by Destiny, this is an interesting photograph because it really isn't making this yellow object. I'm not really even sure what this is. Perhaps it's a balloon or something. But this is, I just think this is kind of an interesting photograph, and it points out that even when something isn't the primary subject, the placement of this here, this is the area that's in focus up here, but this kind of visually kind of pulls this photograph together and makes it interesting. Now, dominant subject, I think this is a great photograph. This is one of the best ones turned in, and I think it's really nice primarily because Allison Smith gave this some thought, and it's maybe a little whimsical, or I'm not sure what you'd call it, but I like the idea. Here's the dominant object, but it is a landscape, and you can see stuff back here. So this is nice. It actually doesn't necessarily fit the rule of thirds thing, but remember, the rule of thirds is really kind of like guidelines more than anything. So this is a very effective photograph with a dominant object in the front. Landon, I think this is really creative, and it's doing a couple of things, really. It does make the hand a dominant object in the front. It's also, the hand is blocking out the sun, because if you're shooting into the sun, the exposure of the bright sunlight would just make all this other stuff basically a total shadow. It's somewhat shadowy now, but you can see some good detail down in here. So this is a really clever photograph that Landon turned in. I like it a lot. This is another one from Landon. I want to talk about this one a little bit by why I think it's a good photograph. One of the things is the light here, and I think this photograph must have been taken either kind of in the morning or later in the afternoon. The best light for shadows really comes at early in the morning and late in the afternoon when the sun is low on the horizon. It's not necessarily the best light for every circumstance, but it does make interesting light. And what you can see is a range of exposure here. It's actually a bit blown out or overexposed back in this area in here. It's not really a big problem. But what I like is that you can see detail in these shadows down here for the most part, and then you can see brighter areas, you can still see detail. So that's a good sign. Another thing with the railroad tracks is it gives what we call perspective, and that is that your eye is kind of drawn to the background because of these lines of the rails, and because there are parallel lines that go back a ways, they disappear. Let me go to the next one here, and this is from Theresa, and it's a similar thing. And again, it's the railroad tracks, and this is just what happens when you see stuff, and eventually back here the stuff disappears. Really, it just becomes, the two tracks become merged as one, and this is called the vanishing point. And what's really nice about this, Theresa managed to line up this vanishing point with the rule of thirds area over here. So it's both vertically and horizontally on the third, right at that intersection right in there, and that makes this a really good photograph. Now this is just a personal choice, and I like it because what you get is a framing effect here. I think this may be a plantation near New Orleans, Louisiana, called Oak Alley. If it's not, it sure looks a lot like it. And it's just kind of interesting. And then there's this real symmetrical thing with the sidewalk, and she's right on the sidewalk looking straight ahead, perpendicular. So you've got that kind of symmetry, and then sort of as a contrast to that, you have these very curvy, irregular tree lines. So that made it an interesting photo. The second set of things, and this is real difficult, particularly if you're shooting with a mobile phone camera, it's to freeze the action. And of course, the way you freeze the action with a single lens reflex is you change your shutter speed to a very quick shutter speed. So it's open very briefly, like 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, like that. And that's what you want to do is with the SLR camera, you want to make the shutter go fast, and you have different priority modes on your camera, and it's a bit technical and you should read your manual for your specific camera, but basically you're going to want to prioritize the shutter speed, and that means that the aperture will adjust accordingly. And the other element that you can use to change this is ISO. So when you crank up the ISO and make your camera more sensitive to the light, you have more ability to actually freeze the action with a faster shutter speed. I think this is really great. The dog is obviously taken off. I like the shadow down here. This is at kind of a thirds intersection area over here, so that's all good. Ideally, you probably wouldn't want all this stuff back here, and it would be nice if the focus was more up here and more fuzzed out back here, but it's not a big deal. Nobody's looking back there. When you look at this photo, you're looking at the dog, and it's really good. Now when we get into photo editing, there's some things you can do that will help you with the background, for example, and with exposure. This is a little bit overexposed up in here. There are things you can do in the editing process. So that was Jade's. This is Destiny Maynard's, and this is freezing action, and I guess probably a jet ski or something. So this created this spray, and because it was taken with a fast shutter speed, probably a 500th of a second, I'm guessing, or maybe more, all these drops are just frozen. So that's what the freezing the action is. And this is something that's really kind of difficult to do with a cell phone without getting an app. I should mention that if you're using a cell phone, there's a ton of really interesting apps that you can get that work with your camera and will let you do many things like a single lens reflex camera. Most of them cost you a little bit of money, but there's a lot of really good ones that are $1, $2, maybe $4, something like that. So you might want to do a Google search and see if you can get an app that will allow you to actually do some settings on your iPhone or cell phone camera that are kind of equivalent to what a single lens reflex camera can do. All right, capture the moment. And this isn't about shutter speed or anything on the technical side. It's just about being there at the right time in the right place. And some of it is just dumb luck. Some of it is just, you know, you're just fortunate to be there and you had the camera ready to go and you got a great shot. Some of it can be planned a little bit. I don't know how planned out this was, but I think this is Destiny's effort here. Works really nicely, and it kind of captures the joy of this family group, I assume, embracing. Kind of nice. Ashley Pearson had this one, and capture the moment is, you know, there's not much of a moment here, but I kind of like the fact that the subject is actually sort of looking down and kind of got a little bit of a crouch here. I mean, if I were standing out there, I'd be a little bit scared. But I understand this looks kind of reminds me of a Little River Canyon. One thing that could have made this a little bit better, and this is being real picky again, but if she had composed it, I actually kind of cropped this to make it work from this to this. So you can see in this situation I've manipulated this a little bit to have the subject on this line of thirds here. And what this does is it kind of makes more of this expanse out here available. This isn't a bad photograph at all. This is just another way to approach it using the rule of thirds. Okay, so this is Ashley's capture the moment. I think this is a great photo. The fact that the dog's nose and tongue and part of its head are off frame, that it really doesn't hurt, because what you're doing is you're kind of capturing the sort of exuberance of dog, and if you have a dog, you can really relate to this. This background here, you know, it's irrelevant because everybody's looking at the dog, but you can see in this one how this is out of focus and the dog is in focus. So this is that technique that's called bokeh. And in your portrait area, there's some video and articles that relate to creating the bokeh effect. But basically what you're doing is you're changing the depth of field with your camera. Now, if you've got a new iPhone 7, 8, or 10, they actually have a setting in there called Portrait, and it will do this automatically for you. It will focus on here, and it'll throw the background out of focus. That's the bokeh effect. And it's something it's very effective in photography. Now, this is Destiny's, and I think this is one of the best photos that was submitted. I just really like the action of this guy and the gulls here, and just kind of the totality of the gulls. There's a little bit of busyness and stuff around here. You know, in an ideal sense, it would be great if this was out on a beach or something like that. But it's not really harmful, and in fact, you're getting a little bit of the out of focus, which softens it up and makes it less annoying. But nice photo here. And this is Alexis Downs, and I don't know whether this was a posed photo, but it doesn't really matter because it's a really neat photo. And one of the things that makes it cool is that these the subjects here are standing in front of the waterfall, which is very white, and it actually illuminates them a little bit. Now, technically, it would be nice if you could go in and edit and lighten this person up a little bit and some things like that. Now, you can see that the shutter, in this sense, wasn't freezing the action. The motion of the water was going along, and when the shutter was open, the water was moving, and that's what creates that kind of blurred effect. And then this is another one from Allison Smith, and it's a landscape, and it's I wanted to include it because I think we don't often think about shooting at night, but maybe we should. And it's just kind of an ordinary street scene. I'm not sure if this is Boaz, but it's you know, it's some town. Now, what I do really appreciate from Allison and some of the others is that you have put in what your camera settings were when this photograph was taken. And this is something you all need to do, is on every photograph, put in your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed, and I would actually prefer if you put in the camera that you're using. So if you're using a Nikon D90, or if you're using an iPhone or whatever. Now, if you're using a cell phone, it may be a little more difficult to get this information. One of the things that you can do is, if you have a Flickr account, you can send your photos up to Flickr and it will kind of break this stuff down for you automatically, and you can just see it there. But anyway, the work that was turned in, some of it was really, really good, and some of the photos that I've shared with you here I really, really like. Others of you missed the mark. Some of you didn't understand or didn't have the ability to do the freeze the action. That's very tricky to do, but it's something worth learning about. Always read the instructions carefully, and if you have any questions, let me know, because I don't always describe things in a way that people understand them. I mean, that's kind of the nature of communications. And if you have any issues, please just communicate with me, and I'll help you as best I can.